Okay, let's begin. So today we are here because we have a webinar under the SITBA, and I welcome you all for participating, and I also have the pleasure of introducing Astrid Nørfelt to you. First of all, I should say that this session is recorded, and there will be a Q&A session after the presentation by Astrid. And there'll also be a short poll that we would like you to participate in. Astrid did her master's at University of Copenhagen, but her master thesis, she did that at CBS. After the thesis, Astrid went to RMIT University in Australia, and is now working on such areas as evolutionary psychology and consumer choice biases, and she does so using qualitative and quantitative methods. Astrid has, in a short time, because she's almost finishing her PhD, has in a short time published in such top journals as Journal of Travel Research and Annals of Tourism Research. These are two of the very top journals within tourism. So without further ado, I give the word to Astrid. Enjoy.
Thank you. Just quickly share my screen. So hopefully you should be able to see that now.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar, which will be on the effects of xenophilia on tourism. As Alexander already said, my name is Astrid Nørfelt, and I'm a final year PhD candidate at RMIT University in Melbourne. And my research interests include tourist and consumer behavior, intergroup biases, and evolutionary psychology, which coincidentally also are topics that I will be talking about today. So more specifically, I want to start out by talking a little bit about mental representations, and this will bring me towards a more in-depth discussion of tourism xenophilia. For this discussion, I will take point of departure in an article that I have published in Journal of Travel Research in collaboration with Alexander and Florian Koch from Copenhagen Business School. I will then talk a little bit about the implications of taking into account tourism xenophilia, and I will talk about some future opportunities for research on this topic. And then, as Alexander said, at the end, there will be some time for questions and comments. So tourists form mental representations of what they believe or feel about different destinations. Examples of mental representations could be that Paris is a romantic city, that Japan has nice food, but mental representations can also be of a more affective nature, such as a general liking of a given destination. As an example, my husband, he has a particular liking of Germany that he has had with him throughout his whole life. He has this story he likes to tell about when he was a young boy in Iran. He saw someone driving this beautiful yellow Porsche 911, and it made him picture Germany as this kind of utopian place where everyone would be driving their nice cars around. So in this way, it's possible to have a particular liking of a place. So the types of mental representations that I just mentioned can be divided into two general groups. So some mental representations are related to the performance of a destination, and other mental representations go beyond these more objective quality requirements. As an example, the rather vast destination image literature that I'm sure many of you are familiar with would be a performance-related cognition. But because tourists are also guided by mental representations that go beyond those performance-related aspects, it's important to also take those types of phenomena into account. And this is where the notion of tourism biases becomes relevant. So tourism biases are performance-unrelated representations. In that sense, they involve an interpretive judgment that the response is unfair, illegitimate, or unjustifiable, in the sense that it goes beyond the objective requirements or evidence of the situation. So while people may feel that they are able to justify why they dislike or like a given place, the term bias here implies that these kinds of reasons will go beyond the more performance-related aspects of that destination. More specifically, we can say that tourism biases are kind of predispositions towards people or objects that the individual associates with an in or out group. So these kinds of predispositions can be either positive or negative, and then relate to an in-group, so a group that the person feels that they are a member of, or an out-group, so that is a group that an individual do not perceive themselves to be a member of. So maybe this is a little bit abstract, but I think that will become more clear in the next slide. So tourism researchers have in more recent years started examining tourism biases. And the tourism biases that have been examined can actually be visualized in a matrix like the one you can see here. So because tourism biases can be either positive or negative, we can have an attraction or a repulsion on one axis. And then we have the target of the bias on the other axis, which in a tourism context could be either the domestic country. So that is a kind of in-group bias in this example, or a specific foreign country, or kind of foreignness in general. So these latter two would more relate to out-group biases. So I'll just now briefly go through the different biases that we have in the matrix. So first, there is tourism ethnocentrism. Tourism ethnocentrism relates to an attraction towards the tourist's own destination. So it has, for example, been shown that people who are high on tourism ethnocentrism will want to economically support their own country through, for example, traveling domestically, or through an increased support for tourism development in their own country. It's also possible to have an attraction towards a specific foreign country. This is what's covered, for example, by tourism affinity, which could relate back to the example of my husband and Germany that I mentioned before. Another type of attraction towards a specific foreign destination is covered by the notion of place solidarity. So place solidarity is a kind of compassion that a person can feel towards a given place. This is, for example, an interesting notion to take into account when it comes to the current war in Ukraine, because this type of event can make people from other countries feel compassion towards Ukraine, and then perhaps want to support the country in different ways that they're able to. On the other hand of the scale, we have animosity, which is repulsion towards a specific foreign country. So animosity could, for example, arise due to some particular antagonistic history between two countries, but it could also be based on personal experience that a tourist has had. And people who are high on animosity will, for example, be less open to being welcoming of tourism from the country they feel animosity towards. And a repulsion towards foreigners can also be in a broader sense. So it's actually, this is what's covered by tourist xenophobia, which is a negative predisposition towards foreign destinations in general. So tourist xenophobia is, for example, reflected in tourists kind of wanting to protect themselves a little bit from locals and local culture when they travel. So they might still choose to travel, but they'll take steps to keep a certain distance. Like maybe they will prefer to travel in groups with people from their own region of the world, or they might prefer to buy travel insurance and things like that. So this then leaves us with two empty spots in the matrix. So one can be a possibility for future research. I leave that open to you. But the other one is what I will be just discussing further today, which is an attraction to foreignness in general. Because people do indeed feel attracted to foreign things, places, people, and objects because they're foreign. So there's something kind of alluring in that quality of foreignness that things can have. And this is something we see reflected in, for example, the types of products that people purchase. Some people, they choose to get like Japanese kanji tattoos or wear t-shirts with writing in a foreign language, even though they don't speak those languages. So that's a way to kind of engage a bit with foreignness. But people also kind of immerse themselves in foreignness through food consumption or through traveling. So psychology scholars have studied this notion under the label of xenophilia. And xenophilia, the word comes from ancient Greek and roughly translates to something like an attraction to the foreign. As we saw before with the matrix, we can position xenophilia as a positive outgroup bias. And while the psychology literature on xenophilia has been relatively scarce, especially compared to something like xenophobia, xenophilia has still been linked to a number of human beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. So it has, for example, been shown that xenophilia is linked to an increased willingness to interact with outgroup members and a kind of curiosity towards foreign cultures and traditions. And prior tourism literature has also hinted at the importance of xenophilia. So in Cohen's tourism typology, for instance, it's argued that tourists differ in the degree to which they wish to seek out strangeness. And the tourist motivation literature also include notions of exploring the unknown and similar things as motivations for traveling. However, even though xenophilia seems to be a particularly relevant notion to look at in a tourism context, because tourism necessarily involves some interaction with foreignness, there's been little to no tourism research that has investigated xenophilia as an important bias in any explicit sense. So for this purpose, we therefore set out to, with our study, to conceptualize and operationalize tourism xenophilia, as well to examine possible antecedents and outcomes of this construct. So for this purpose, we started out by building on social and evolutionary psychology to define tourism xenophilia as an individual's attraction towards the perceived foreignness of destinations. In that way, the definition covers that it's the perceptions of foreignness that are important here, rather than some kind of objective measurement of how foreign two places are from each other. We also argue that tourism xenophilia can manifest itself in curiosity and fascination based on this kind of literature streams. So we didn't just want to define tourism xenophilia, we also wanted to explore a little bit why this kind of bias would exist in the first place. And for this purpose, we took point of departure in evolutionary psychology, which is a discipline that's based on the idea that we have inherited important psychological mechanisms from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So in this way, it's not just our bodies that have been shaped by the forces of evolution, it's our minds as well. And evolutionary psychology, for example, holds that we have a drive to avoid harm, a drive to reproduce, a drive to find and keep allies, but also a drive to explore. Indeed, our ancestors had to explore new regions to increase their chances of survival, because exploration has been linked to a number of benefits for them. So exploring could, for example, help our ancestors to find new places to live, to find new food resources, to make new allies, to meet potential new mates, and potentially also to learn about new technologies and so on. And it's been argued that xenophilia is actually an expression of exploration. So in that sense, we might see xenophilia as a trait that has evolved to motivate people to engage in exploratory activities. And Sushman also argues that a xenophilic personality has roots in the benefits of traveling across unfamiliar territories. So in this way, by rooting tourism xenophilia in the notion of exploration, we can then explain why this kind of bias would exist in the first place. So after having conceptualized tourism xenophilia, we wanted to next operationalize this construct as well as to test potential outcomes and antecedents of it. And we did so across 3 studies. For the skill development, we followed existing skill development procedures, including, for example, factor analysis. And for the outcome and antecedents testing, we used structural equation modeling. We collected data from US participants through MTurk, and we put in place different quality requirements to ensure the quality of the data, such as excluding people who got an attention check wrong. And this led us to have the sample sizes that you can see in the slide here, which we considered to be adequate for this type of study. So based on the approach that I just mentioned, we ended up developing the tourism xenophilia scale that you can see here, which exhibited adequate reliability and validity. It, for example, includes items like, I am fascinated with foreign destinations, and my curiosity is aroused by foreign destinations, which then link back to our idea that tourism xenophilia can be manifested in these kinds of states. So next, we developed 10 hypotheses on tourism xenophilia's potential antecedents and outcomes. And I'll just now go briefly through our findings in this regard. So first of all, we wanted to examine if tourism xenophilia would have an effect on kind of classic tourism outcomes. And this was an important step because we needed to kind of figure out if tourism xenophilia would even be an important construct for tourism scholars to include in their models. So here we took point of departure in the variables of willingness to engage with locals, willingness to visit foreign destinations, actual number of trips to foreign destinations, willingness to stay at a B&B, and intention to try local food. And these outcome variables or potential outcome variables can all be theoretically linked to tourism xenophilia because they relate to some kind of interaction with foreignness. For example, a willingness to visit foreign destination is obviously relates to some kind of a willingness to engage more with a foreign place. And something like willingness to stay at a B&B might comprise more of an interaction with the local culture than something like staying at a chain hotel. And these hypotheses were all confirmed, which then shows us that tourism xenophilia indeed could be a relevant variable to include in many models when it comes to wanting to examine tourism behaviors. So we didn't just want to examine if tourism xenophilia would have an effect on people in their role as tourists. We also wanted to see if tourism xenophilia would also have an effect on resident behaviors when they're in their home destination, home country. So for this purpose, we included the variables of resident hospitality and support for immigration policies in our model as well. And again, these can be theoretically linked to tourism xenophilia because they relate to a kind of willingness to interact with, or at least a kind of acceptance of foreignness being present in the home country. And these hypotheses were also confirmed, which shows us that tourism xenophilia does indeed also influence people in their role as residents. Lastly, we wanted to examine what types of variables might influence the levels of tourism xenophilia. And for this, we took point of departure in 3 traits from the psychology literature that has not seen so much application in the tourism literature as yet. So a kind of side goal of ours was also to point attention to the importance of including these kinds of traits in tourism models. And the specific variables we included were promotion focus. So that is an individual's tendency to kind of focus on the possibility of positive outcomes rather than the avoidance of negative outcomes. Boredom proneness, which is an individual's tendency to experience boredom, and mind wandering, which is an individual's tendency to engage in kind of daydreaming. And these can be theoretically linked to tourism xenophilia because promotion focus, for example, has been shown to also be linked to a tendency to be open to new alternatives. And boredom proneness might incite people to engage in behaviors that are aimed to kind of escape the boredom, which could include trying out new things, for example. And with mind wandering, we expected that people might engage in mind wandering about foreign destinations, which could incite a kind of curiosity towards foreign destinations. And these hypotheses were again confirmed, which then gives us more insight into the types of factors that shape levels of tourism xenophilia. So based on those findings, we can conclude that tourism xenophilia would indeed be something that's relevant to for tourism scholars to include in future models when it comes to wanting to examine both tourist behaviors but also resident behaviors. And since our initial studies, there has been some new studies that have also been referred to tourism xenophilia to explain different behaviors. So this then kind of provides evidence to our initial argument. So Sharma and co-authors, for example, did a study on social return, travel envy, and tourism xenophilia among 2 generations. And they found that tourism xenophilia actually decreases local travel behavior, and especially so for millennials. So they explained this by noting that because tourism xenophilia involves an attraction to foreignness, people who are high on tourism xenophilia might not feel that the local destination offers enough foreignness to be of interest. So this then also aligns well with the logic that we applied in our hypothesis development in the original study. But tourism xenophilia also has practical implications. So it might, for instance, be interesting for practitioners to consider tourism xenophilia as a way to kind of segment tourists and figure out who to target, but potentially also as a way to better understand how people who score differently on xenophilia, how they can be, how you can better customize offers to fit their needs. So for instance, it might be easier to convert a person to be a customer if they're high on tourism xenophilia, because they already have a kind of natural inclination to be interested in going to a new foreign country. On the other hand, if we look at, for example, people who score low on tourism xenophilia compared to people who score high on tourism xenophilia, we might get an idea of how they can be targeted. So for example, people who score relatively low on tourism xenophilia might prefer to stay in kind of chain hotels. They might prefer to travel with groups of people from their general region in the world, and they might prefer to be offered a selection of dishes that are already familiar to them. And the exact opposite could be said for people who score higher on tourism xenophilia. Another thing, another type of practical implications of taking into account tourism xenophilia could be that it offers insight into how the relationship between tourists and residents could be managed. So we found that tourism xenophilia increases people's willingness to engage with locals, but also that tourism xenophilia increases resident hospitality. So it could be that when tourism xenophilia is high, there would be less conflicts between these two types of groups. So that could be something interesting to look further into. So to kind of sum up a little bit, we now know many things. We know that tourism xenophilia is a positive general outward bias, and that it can be rooted in an evolutionary drive to explore. We also know how it can be measured, and that it affects various tourist and resident behaviors, and that it's related to boredom proneness, promotion focus, and mind wandering. But there's also many things that we still don't know at this stage, and that could invite further research. So I'll now talk a little bit about 4 of such topics, and I hope that that might also make you reflect a little bit on how tourism xenophilia might affect some of the topics that you are interested in studying. So first of all, it might seem that tourism xenophilia is a rather positive bias because it is reflected in behaviors that might seem like positive, at least on the surface. But it's also possible that tourism xenophilia could have some unintended consequences. So we, for example, saw that tourism xenophilia increases the willingness to engage with locals. But what this particular engagement with locals look like could vary from a kind of willingness to learn and listen to locals over into what we might call a gazing upon locals who might not always be in a position of power. So it could also be that tourism xenophilia could increase the willingness to engage in rather controversial forms of tourism, like slum tourism or indigenous tourism, which have been shown to have some not always very positive effects on local communities. In fact, they can have pretty detrimental consequences for local communities. So to kind of explore this a little bit further, it might be interesting to take point of departure in literature that already exists on the consumption of exoticness. And it might be interesting to start with something like an exploratory qualitative analysis to get a more in-depth understanding of when tourism xenophilia might benefit host country residents and when it might have negative effects. Another thing that could be interesting to look further into is how destination image and tourism xenophilia interact. So as a kind of parallel in marketing, it has, for example, been found that a positive country image can be overridden by a negative country bias. So in a study, Klein, for example, found that while Chinese people, at least at in this particular study and at this time, often had a perception of Japanese products as being of high quality, yet that because of a kind of animosity towards Japan, they would refuse to buy those products in many cases. So this then shows us that there can be this kind of interaction between a country image or destination image in our case and a bias. So this then it might be possible to come up with some diverging predictions that could be tested here. For example, if a person has a high animosity towards a particular country, could that be overridden by tourism xenophilia to some extent, or would that kind of animosity override any level of tourism xenophilia? It would also be interesting to look at how tourism xenophilia interacts with other tourism biases. So, for example, whether tourism xenophilia and tourism xenophobia, if they're completely mutually exclusive, or if it's possible that they could coexist in kind of complex ways. It might also be interesting to look at how tourism xenophilia interacts with like animosity or affinity, so biases towards specific countries. And here, again, an interesting parallel is in the marketing literature. So Astrid Nørfelt, for example, did a study where they found that there is this kind of tug of war, so kind of complex relationship between country general biases and country specific ones. So they suggest that it's important to take both of these into account to have a more complete picture of what actually influences tourist decisions. And lastly, I don't know, maybe you are all sick of talking about this by now, but the COVID-19 pandemic has affected a lot of assumptions in tourism. And it would also be relevant to look at if the COVID-19 pandemic could have affected levels of tourism xenophilia. So I think the most obvious kind of hypotheses or initial hypotheses in this regard would be that the COVID-19 pandemic could have had a negative effect on levels of tourism xenophilia. And there is some literature that would point in this direction. For example, in evolutionary psychology, it has been shown that in regions where there is a high degree of pathogen stress, so where there is a higher risk of catching a disease, kind of values associated with xenophilia tend to be low, and vice versa. A recent tourism study also predicts a similar thing by noting that continuing fear and anxiety related to the COVID-19 pandemic may challenge travelers' predispositions towards xenophilia. And Kim and co-authors have also predicted that people who, because there has been this freedom restriction during the pandemic, people who are high on tourism xenophilia might be particularly prone to want to seek variety when that becomes possible. So in that case, we might also predict that there could be some kind of delayed positive effect on xenophilia once people perceive that disease threat is lower. Yeah, I think that's all I had for now. Thank you very much for listening. I think there will be time now for the Q&A section.
Exactly. Thank you, Astrid. That was super interesting. So we have the Q&A session, and you're very welcome to ask questions. We already have the first one. The first one is, by performance-based recognition, does it mean economic performance of the nation?
Okay, so I think that relates back to what I was talking initially about the mental representations. So by performance-based, we just mean that these kinds of mental representations relate more to kind of objective things that are associated with a given destination. So for instance, when it comes to destination image, which we label as this performance-related type of cognition, it could be things like that. Like I said, like Japan has nice food, or Japan has the Tokyo Tower, or Japan is a nice country to visit. So things that relate directly to how the place would perform as a tourist destination, rather than things that go beyond those more objective quality criteria. We could, for example, also imagine that a person has had a either very good or very bad experience with Japanese people, or with going to Japan or something, which could have led them to have a kind of generally negative or positive predispositions towards Japan that kind of goes beyond those expectations of how the tourist destination is. So yeah, I hope that's clear. Otherwise, yeah, Alexander, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's quite clear, but maybe the performance is not the performance of the nation, right?
Oh yeah. So it's not about the all right. Yeah, it's not about the economic performance of a given nation, no. So it's not about whether it attracts many tourists in general or that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's rather the performance in the eyes of the tourist as a destination. Okay, then we have another one. I can see everyone can just ask questions. Some of them they say anonymous. That's fine, but then unfortunately we don't know who it is. And then we have a question from Suk. Not sure if this is relevant to your research, but do you see a drastic change in the dynamics of xenophilia and xenophobia between the West and the East before and after COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay. Yeah, so this is also what I touched upon a little bit in the end. So yeah, indeed, this would be something that could be interesting to look further into, how levels of xenophilia and xenophobia have potentially changed, and potentially also how that looks like in different parts of the world. So we, like Alexander and I and our co-authors, we also did a study on COVID-19 and how that has affected xenophobia, for instance, and we found that COVID-19 has actually had a positive effect on xenophobia. So there is some initial evidence there, but it might be interesting to look further into whether that could differ in different parts of the world. Of course, when we talk about xenophilia and xenophobia, we talk about a general predisposition towards foreignness. So it's not about, for example, let's say in this regard, like bias for or against particular nations. So, for example, if we want to look further into something like how people's perceptions of China, if they associate China with the COVID-19 pandemic, how that has changed, then it's rather another type of bias that should be looked into.
Yeah, perfect. And I can see that Erica would like to comment on this question as well. Erica, do you want to comment live? Maybe not. Then we'll take the next one. The next one is by Satya. Is xenophilia general in nature, like attraction to anything foreign? To the homeland? How would you define attraction towards only certain foreign places?
Yeah, so if we think back on the matrix, if we're talking about an attraction towards a specific foreign country, it would rather be covered by affinity. So xenophilia is indeed very general in nature because it is this attraction towards foreign things in general. So in that case, yeah, it's like a general kind of value or trait of a person to be attracted to foreignness in that way, a general predisposition towards foreign things.
Thank you. And then we have another question in regards to the different tourism biases that you mentioned. For practical implications, how can we differentiate between specific country biases, such as affinity, and tourism xenophilia? Which one is the better tool for a marketer to leverage? That's an interesting question. Right?
Yeah, so I think that also relates to what I just said a little bit, right? So because xenophilia is something that relates to a general predisposition towards foreignness as this general notion, rather than something like affinity, which relates to a specific foreign country. So which one is a better tool a marketer can leverage? So again, here, this also relates a little bit to the future research opportunity I mentioned, to examining a little bit more the relationships between these types of biases. But I would say that it's not that one is a better tool than others. Ideally, you would need to have an idea of the levels of the different types of biases, but it also depends on the specific situation. Like if you are a marketer, let's say in Australia, like where I am now, and you want to, for example, advertise Australia as a tourist destination, then of course it's important to have an understanding of how levels of affinity and animosity towards Australia are in that foreign country you are interested in. But it would also be relevant to have a look at kind of general levels of xenophilia and xenophobia, because in the end, all these different biases will interact and possibly in quite complex ways sometimes. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's definitely the scope to do some follow-up studies that look further into those kinds of dynamics.
I think that was that one. Then we have another question in regards to the different tourism biases. No, we just had that one. Out of curiosity, is general xenophilia towards any country, the US, China, Singapore, and so on, do you perceive that as being on a rising or falling trend?
Yeah, so because of the COVID, so I don't have any specific numbers on this. And again, it's important to highlight that when we speak of xenophilia, it's not towards those specific places, but more general predisposition. But it's very possible that because of the pandemic that we have just been through, that general levels of xenophilia might have seen a decrease, because it's simply not been, and we've not really had the freedom to express this kind of predisposition in any way. And also because it's possible that from an evolutionary standpoint, that disease cues could lower this type of bias and instead decrease our tendency towards xenophobia.
I guess did you mean xenophobia? I mean xenophilia, right?
Did I say the wrong one?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Xenophilia. And then we have a question: what tactics can businesses use to increase tourism xenophilia?
Yeah, that's interesting. How could you increase it? What would you say, Alexander? Is there a magic way of increasing it?
I think that would be difficult, right? Because remember that you tied it to exploration, right?
Yeah. So perhaps, by looking at if we see exploration indeed as the root, so then we could look into how that kind of exploration motive, how we might be able to activate that in ways. But because it is this, because we also see it as this general predisposition of a person, I'm not sure if a business alone can increase the general level of tourism xenophilia, but rather can speak to that level of tourism xenophilia.
Yeah. So if I can just comment on that, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Because yeah, xenophilia is like a deep-rooted like tendency or value in people, right? When you say so, Astrid. And then we can probably, yeah, they can probably activate it or speak to it, as you say. That probably is the way to go. Makes a lot of sense. So how can DMOs mitigate tourism biases? So this is, I see that as almost the opposite, right? So if there's a bias, but it's negative to us, how can we then sort of mitigate it?
Yeah. So yeah, again, this is this is kind of a complex thing. So first of all, one thing that would be important to understand is like the general levels of the different biases, because that might help you to identify potential opportunities in how you can act. So for example, if you find out that tourist xenophobia is high, you might still identify an opportunity to advertise your particular destination if you find out that maybe affinity towards that place is high, because then that might be able to override something like a generally more xenophobic predisposition. But then it would also be relevant to look at perhaps different clusters of tourists. Because even if something like xenophobia is generally high in a place, there would probably still be groups of tourists for which that wouldn't be the case. So having a more nuanced understanding then of the levels for different groups could be relevant to see who might be easier to target in a particular place.
Yeah, thank you. There's also the notion of consumer globalness, right? So maybe a brand can invoke a more global.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yeah. Also, when we talk about like companies in general, like outside of a consumer context, to kind of advertise yourself more as global, or at least to not really advertise your specific origin or your product's association with that origin. That can be a way to mitigate that as well, because you just advertise you kind of create a distance to the origin, if that could be perceived as a negative thing in a particular market.
Do you have any ideas of any brand that has sort of done that, where we don't, even if we have animosity, we don't see them as almost originating from that country?
Let me think. I'm sure there's many. We always think about the ones that are like really heavily associated with a particular place. So that's the opposite. Do you have one in mind?
No, but maybe something, although we can associate, but still something like Coca-Cola, maybe. I mean,
yeah, you see that as a very much a global brand. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, could be. It's not like they put like I don't know, American flags, so.
Yeah, or Lenovo or something like it.
Yeah.
Thank you from Ashik. And then we have a question: Do countries that share similar culture or have close proximity naturally have affinity towards one another?
In many cases, yes, I think so. Doesn't have to be the case, right? There can also be examples of countries who perhaps have fought many wars or had many conflicts with their neighboring countries, in which case it might rather be animosity that would be the relevant one to look at. But yeah, I think in many cases we might feel an affinity towards our neighbors, because there is this perhaps cultural proximity or a common history in many cases. Like I think if we look at Scandinavia, for instance, there's this almost common language at times and very much a common history. And I think there's definitely a high affinity amongst those countries, right? You can just look at who Denmark votes for in the Eurovision every year, and it's Sweden. So perhaps, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe we can say a bit about, I don't know if you want to involve Ukraine, Russia.
Sorry?
Because so Ukraine and Russia, right? They have
yeah.
similar cultures. Yeah. So,
and right now I think perhaps evoking an affinity from Ukraine towards Russia would be very much the wrong construct to evoke here, right? Would rather go in the opposite direction to animosity.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Marilyn. In order to promote Xenophilia, Egyptian tourism authority promoted pride in their own destinations as an answer to the previous question. Okay, so I think this was a comment to the previous question.
Yeah. Okay, as a suggestion of someone who had used this kind of strategy.
Yeah. Exactly. So how would you, so when they promote pride in their own destinations, what would you see that as?
No, because that's we would rather label that tourism ethnocentrism than, at least if it's meant to, let's say, get the Egyptians to travel locally, to support the local tourism economy, then it's probably rather tourism ethnocentrism that is the relevant bias, because that is exactly an attraction towards the domestic country and this kind of willingness to support your own destination. So I think that's also something that perhaps out of very much necessity we have seen also in connection with the pandemic, right? That a lot of these tourism organizations have played a little bit on this ethnocentric people to get people to travel locally.
Thank you. So then we have a question about Paris. Do you see Paris as a good example of realization of xenophilia? Because I've always heard of people that they hold such wonderful expectations about Paris when visiting the place.
Yeah, so again, here I think it's conflating a little bit tourism, xenophilia, and affinity, because tourism xenophilia is not geared towards any particular place, but rather this general attraction to foreignness. So it could very well be that someone visits Paris because they are high on tourism xenophilia and they want to experience a new foreign country. But when people have this general, very positive predispositions towards France or Paris, then it's rather affinity because it's targeting a specific place based on some kind of perhaps experience with the country, or at least a kind of idea of what they think the country will be like. So I would say that Paris is a good example of affinity. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. For sure. So what if these expectations? Does it matter what they are? What if these expectations are that the French are very romantic, that Paris is a very romantic city?
Yeah.
And that it has many.
And then maybe also destination image is the relevant thing to look at there. Yeah. If it's these kind of very specific things, which I guess it is in many cases, right? I think that France or Paris has a very positive destination image for many tourists.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Anonymous attendee.
Yeah, so it seems that we have no more questions, no more open questions. If no one has any more questions, then thank you, Astrid. That was very, very good, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And now we have this poll that I talked about in the beginning. It's just a brief satisfaction poll, so if you could all fill it out, we'd be very happy. Thank you for participating from my side. I don't know if you want to say a few words, Astrid.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I hope that was interesting for you to listen to a little bit about the research that we have done. And yeah, if anything, I hope that many of you might reflect a little bit on how tourism biases could be relevant in some of the work that you're doing. And yeah, feel free to contact me if you have any more questions after this session. Reach out if you want to discuss anything.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.